Experiments versus observational studies. Students will be able to describe the differences between an observational study and an experiment. In the previous lesson, we had an introduction to experiments. Today, we're going to look at how they differ from observational studies. Our first few lessons focused on techniques for sample surveys. A sample survey is one example of an observational study. Another example might be if a researcher observed the behavior of animals in the wild or a group of people. In an observational study, researchers attempt to measure some variable of interest without trying to influence the outcome or the response variable. Experiments differ from observational studies in that they impose a treatment on individuals to measure their response. Remember, a treatment is some condition applied to the individuals of an experiment called experimental units, or subjects if human. We want to be able to determine whether that treatment causes a change in the response. Most recognizably, a treatment could be some new pharmaceutical drug that needs to be tested and approved before being admitted to the market. But take a look at 3 possible research questions to see that treatments are not only pharmaceutical drugs. The first research question, does regular tutoring improve student test scores in math? Does practicing yoga reduce blood pressure? And lastly, does listening to music while taking tests improve scores? Now, for each of these questions, we could design either an observational study or an experiment. However, the types of conclusions we can draw from either will be different. Well-designed experiments can help us determine cause and effect between the treatment and response, while observational studies can only show associations between the 2 variables. Let's take a look at the first research question and design both an observational study and an experiment to be able to see how the 2 would differ. The question was, does regular tutoring improve student test scores in math? Let's look at the observational study first. We could carry out a sample survey by randomly selecting 30 students from Bedford-Stuyvesant Preparatory High School to participate in our study. Students would self-report the number of hours of tutoring that they receive in math each week. Students' test scores in math over the same time period would also be recorded. At the end of the study, we'd perform statistical analysis of whether there is any link between the number of hours of tutoring received and test scores. Notice that in this observational study, we as researchers are not imposing any treatment on the students. So let's see how we could approach the same research question now with an experiment. Again, we're going to have 30 students from Bedford-Stuyvesant Preparatory High School take part in this study. Hopefully they're volunteering because we can't force people to participate in our experiment. We're going to randomly assign 3 treatments to all of the students. Remember, random assignment was a key essential principle of basic experimental design. So 10 students would receive 4 hours of tutoring weekly, 10 students would receive 1 hour tutoring weekly, and 10 students would receive no hours of tutoring weekly. Students' test scores in math over the same time period would be recorded, and a statistical analysis of whether tutoring caused an increase in the test scores would also be carried out. Notice here that in an experiment, we are imposing a treatment on my students. So this is what your homework is going to be. Your homework has 2 parts. The first part, let's look at it. You're going to think of the observational study and the experiment we just designed to test the effectiveness of tutoring and improving math scores. So feel free to scroll the video back if you want to relook at the 2 the designs of the observational study and the experiment. Your first question. What are some variables in the experiment that we would want to control to be sure our treatments, hours of tutoring, were responsible for the change in the response variable students' test scores? Pause the video now if you're ready to write your response, or feel free to scroll back and relook at the study designs. The next question you're going to consider: what are some variables in the observational study that would be impossible to control and therefore might affect the response variable? Again, pause the video, take time to write your response. Your responses will be brought into class the following day, so make sure that you're prepared to speak about your ideas. These ideas about control are going to take us to our next topic that we will explore in the following video, so make sure that you think about these questions deeply. Finally, part 2 of your homework: design an observational study and an experiment for either of the 2 remaining research questions. Let's see if I can take you back to those research questions so I can remind you. There we go. We have: does practicing yoga reduce blood pressure, and does listening to music while taking tests improve scores? Choose just one question to design both an observational study and an experiment. Let's summarize today's lesson with key ideas. Differences between experiments and observational studies. Experiments impose a treatment. Remember, a treatment is a condition being applied to the experimental units or the subjects. Experiments can also show cause and effect between the treatment, which we can also think of as an explanatory variable, and the response variable. On the other hand, observational studies do not attempt to influence the response variable. In other words, there is no treatment. Lastly, observational studies can only show an association between the explanatory variable and the response variable. Even if my observational study that we designed showed that students who said they were receiving more tutoring did better in math, I would only be able to say there's an association between receiving tutoring and higher math scores. Until I do an experiment, I cannot say that more tutoring causes an increase in math scores.